Mark had always loved exploring new worlds. He was a human who believed that every planet had its own story. Today he had landed on Leora, a planet filled with green forests, sparkling rivers, and strange glowing plants. The air smelled sweet and soft winds moved through tall trees. Everything looked peaceful. But Mark knew that beauty sometimes hid danger. He walked carefully among the giant ferns and bright flowers. His eyes caught a small movement near a tree root. Curious, he went closer. There he saw tiny creatures no bigger than his hand. They had round heads, big sparkling eyes, and tiny arms and legs. They looked frightened and were running in every direction. Suddenly, a small group of wild creatures, strange and fast, appeared. They had sharp teeth and long claws. The tiny aliens tried to climb leaves and hide, but they were too small. Mark's heart beat faster. He could not let these tiny beings get hurt. Without thinking, he raised his voice and threw a small rock to scare the creatures. The creatures growled and circled, but Mark acted quickly. He grabbed a fallen branch and waved it, making a loud noise. The wild creatures froze and then ran away into the forest. The tiny aliens stopped and looked at Mark with wide eyes. They made small sounds that he did not understand, but their faces showed relief and gratitude. Mark smiled and waved. He knelt down carefully to avoid scaring them. One tiny alien stepped forward. It held a shiny leaf and pointed at him. Mark guessed it was a way of saying thank you. He smiled and gently nodded. The little creatures gathered around him, chirping and moving excitedly. He realized they were intelligent and organized. These were not just random animals. They had a society, a home, and feelings. Mark felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. He knew he had discovered something amazing. He decided to follow them to learn more. The tiny aliens led him through tall grass and twisting vines. Mark had to walk carefully so he would not step on anything. Every step revealed new wonders. Tiny glowing insects flew around and flowers opened and closed as if they were watching him. After a while, they reached a hidden village built high in the trees. The houses were made of leaves, petals, and shiny crystals. They were delicate but strong. Bridges of vines connected each home. Mark's eyes widened. He had never seen anything like it. He slowly stepped closer, and the tiny aliens did not seem afraid. They chirped and moved around him, guiding him to a central area where a taller figure waited. The figure was the chief of the village. He was slightly larger than the others, but still very small compared to Mark. His eyes were calm and intelligent. He raised one tiny arm, and all the aliens stopped talking. Mark bowed slightly to show respect. The chief looked at him carefully and then slowly nodded. The chief made small sounds, pointing to Mark and then to the tiny aliens. Mark realized the chief was asking him to understand their ways and accept their gratitude. The chief gave a tiny glowing crystal to one of the small aliens, who ran to Mark and placed it in his hand. The crystal felt warm and a soft light glowed inside. Mark felt honored. The tiny aliens surrounded him, moving excitedly. They seemed happy and safe because of him. Mark smiled. He had only wanted to help, but now he realized how important his actions could be. Even small beings could change the world around them, and he could be part of it. As the sun began to set on Leora, Mark sat near the village, watching the tiny creatures return to their homes. He felt a strange bond with them. He knew this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. He had protected them, and in return they had shown him a world full of wonder and magic. Mark did not know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that he had made new friends, and his heart felt full. The tiny aliens chirped happily around him, and the forest seemed to glow even brighter. For the first time on this planet, Mark felt truly needed and important. The next morning, Mark woke to the sound of tiny voices singing in the forest. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, and the air was filled with the sweet smell of flowers. He stretched and looked around. The tiny aliens were already moving about, busy with their morning tasks. Some were gathering sparkling fruits while others polished small crystal tools. Mark felt amazed. Their village was not just a few homes. It was a carefully organized place. Tiny bridges connected the treetop houses, and miniature gardens grew bright-colored fruits and flowers. Every detail showed care and skill. The tiny aliens noticed Mark watching, and they chirped happily, inviting him to follow them deeper into the village. He walked carefully along a wide leaf that acted as a bridge. His steps were slow, so he would not frighten or hurt anyone. The tiny aliens ran beside him, chatting and pointing at different parts of the village. Mark laughed quietly. Their energy was contagious. Every tiny movement felt full of life. Finally, they reached the largest home in the village. It was shaped like a giant flower and covered in glowing petals. The petals shimmered in the sunlight, creating a soft rainbow of colors. This was the chief's home, and as Mark approached, the tiny aliens fell silent. A figure stepped forward. Chief Pilo was slightly taller than the others, with eyes that shone like polished amber. His face was kind but serious. He raised a small arm to greet Mark. Mark bowed slightly, not fully understanding what to do but hoping it showed respect. The chief smiled. Chief Pilo motioned for Mark to sit on a flat stone near the entrance. Around them, tiny aliens gathered, curious but respectful. The chief spoke in soft musical sounds. Mark could not understand the words, but he watched carefully. The chief pointed to Mark, then to himself, and finally to the village. Mark guessed that the chief was explaining why he had come and what he had done. Then something surprising happened. Chief Pilo raised his hands and motioned to a group of tiny aliens. They brought a small, delicate tray with shining crystals, tiny fruits, and pieces of colorful leaves. Mark realized it was a gift for him. He carefully took a small crystal. The light inside it flickered warmly. He smiled. It was beautiful and full of meaning. The chief made more sounds, pointing to Mark and then to one tiny alien named Lonnie. Lonnie stepped forward, bowing slightly. She was small and delicate, with bright eyes that seemed to sparkle with curiosity. Mark watched her carefully. She chirped and moved quickly, pointing at him and then at different parts of the village. It was as if she wanted to guide him. Mark felt a little nervous. He did not know how to respond. The chief noticed his hesitation and tilted his head kindly. Then he used gestures to explain that Mark's actions had saved their people, and Lonnie would help him understand their ways. Mark finally understood that the chief wanted him to learn from them and share his own knowledge. He nodded slowly. Lonnie chirped happily, hopping onto his shoulder carefully. Her tiny weight made him smile. She pointed to different homes, showing him how the tiny aliens lived. Mark was amazed. Some homes had spinning crystal windmills, while others had small ponds with glowing fish. Every detail was thoughtful and beautiful. Mark followed Lonnie through the village. She showed him how the tiny aliens gathered food, cleaned their homes, and cared for each other. He realized that even though they were small, they had a strong sense of community. Every alien helped another, and every task, no matter how tiny, was important. Mark felt inspired. The chief watched from his home, nodding approvingly. He seemed pleased that Mark was learning quickly. Mark noticed how careful and intelligent the tiny aliens were. Their clever use of plants, stones, and crystals showed he could learn much from them. By the afternoon, Mark sat near a small stream, watching Lonnie demonstrate how to use a leaf boat to carry tiny crystals. He laughed quietly when she pretended the boat was moving too fast and acted surprised. Lonnie chirped happily at his reaction. Mark felt a bond growing between them. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the chief called for everyone to gather. Mark realized it was time for a meeting. Chief Pilo stood in the center, surrounded by tiny aliens, and gestured for Mark to pay attention. The chief's eyes were kind, but he looked serious. He seemed to be preparing Mark for something important. Mark did not know what it could be. He only knew that he had entered a tiny world full of wonder, and that his role here was just beginning. He watched Lonnie hop to his shoulder, ready to guide him further. Mark felt a mix of excitement and curiosity. He had helped them once, but now he was becoming part of their civilization, and every moment promised new surprises and lessons. The next morning, the village was alive with tiny movements and cheerful sounds. Birds with shining feathers flew over the trees, and sparkling insects danced in the sunlight. Mark followed Lonnie through the village. She was excited, chirping and pointing to different areas. He laughed quietly, amazed at how lively and organized the tiny world was. Today, Chief Pilo had called a meeting in the center of the village. All the tiny aliens gathered around, their eyes shining with curiosity and respect. Mark approached carefully, unsure what the chief wanted to show him. Lonnie hopped onto his shoulder, giving him a reassuring chirp. Chief Pilo stood tall, raising his tiny arms to get attention. The village fell silent. Mark noticed that even the smallest aliens looked serious. They seemed to understand the importance of this moment. Chief Pilo spoke in soft musical sounds. Mark could not understand the words, but he watched the chief's gestures carefully. Then something unusual happened. Chief Pilo motioned toward Mark and then to a tiny alien standing nearby. She was small, delicate, and her eyes sparkled with intelligence and energy. Lonnie chirped and moved closer to Mark, pointing at the tiny alien. Mark realized the chief was introducing her as a companion, someone who would stay with him to help him understand their ways. Mark felt stunned. He had never experienced anything like this. He had thought the village would simply thank him and let him continue his exploration. Now they were giving him a tiny companion. He looked down at her, feeling a mix of surprise and curiosity. The tiny alien smiled and waved. She seemed friendly and confident. Chief Pilo pointed to the tiny alien, then to Mark, and then to the village. Mark understood that this was a special honor. The chief wanted him to accept guidance, friendship, and trust from their people. He realized that in this world, giving a companion was a way of showing respect and gratitude, not anything more. Mark took a deep breath. He smiled at the tiny alien and nodded. She chirped happily, hopping onto his hand. Her small weight felt warm, and she seemed eager to begin their journey together. Mark looked around at the village. The tiny aliens were watching him closely. They seemed to expect him to accept the honor with courage and kindness. The tiny alien introduced herself as Neela. She chirped and pointed to Mark, then to the forest around them. Mark laughed quietly. Neela was showing him that she would guide him through their world, help him understand their customs, and keep him safe. She was tiny, but her confidence made him feel that together they could explore anything. For the rest of the morning, Mark and Neela walked through the village. Neela showed him hidden paths, small bridges, and tiny homes. She explained their simple ways, like how they gathered glowing fruits, built homes from petals, and cared for each other. Mark listened carefully, learning quickly. He realized that even small creatures could be brave, intelligent, and wise. Mark began to feel comfortable with Neela. She was cheerful, playful, and brave. She pointed out small dangers like insects that could harm them or weak branches they should avoid. Mark admired her courage. Even though she was tiny, she had the heart of a protector. Around midday, they stopped near a tiny pond. Neela showed him how the village stored water safely using small leaves and crystals. Mark watched closely and offered some ideas from his human experience. Neela chirped happily at his suggestions. The chief had been right to assign her to him. Together, they could share knowledge and protect the village in ways neither could do alone. As the sun climbed higher, Chief Pilo called Mark and Neela to the center of the village again. He held a small crystal high in his tiny hands. The crystal glowed brightly, filling the village with soft light. The chief motioned for Mark to accept it. Mark took it carefully. The warmth of the crystal reminded him that this gift represented trust, friendship, and respect. Mark smiled at Neela. She chirped happily, hopping onto his shoulder. He realized that this strange honor, being given a mini companion, was actually a wonderful opportunity. It was not just about helping the tiny aliens. It was about learning, understanding, and forming a bond across worlds. As the day ended, Mark sat near a small tree, Neela resting on his hand. The village was calm, filled with quiet chirps and soft movements. Mark thought about how unexpected life could be. One day he was exploring a forest. The next he was honored with a tiny companion and welcomed into a new civilization. Mark looked at Neela and felt grateful. He realized that this was only the beginning. With Neela's guidance, he could learn more about the tiny aliens, help them, and grow in ways he had never imagined. Neela chirped and looked up at him as if sharing the same thought. Together they would face new adventures, protect the village, and explore the wonders of Leora. Mark smiled. He had been stunned at first, but now he felt excited and ready. The tiny alien world was full of surprises, and with Neela by his side, he knew that every day would bring something amazing. The morning sun rose over Leora, casting golden light on the tiny village. Mark stretched and yawned, feeling excited for the day. Neela was already awake, chirping softly and hopping around on his shoulder. Her small energy made him smile. Today, he thought, they would explore more of the village and learn together. Neela guided Mark through narrow paths between the treetop homes. She showed him tiny bridges made of intertwined vines. Each bridge was strong, but Mark had to step carefully to avoid breaking them. Neela chirped happily whenever he succeeded. Mark laughed quietly. Even small tasks could feel like adventures in this world. Their first stop was a tiny garden filled with glowing fruits. Neela explained how the aliens grew food. Mark watched carefully as she demonstrated picking the fruits without harming the plants. He tried it himself, holding the small fruit gently between his fingers. Neela chirped with approval, hopping onto his hand. Mark realized that even small creatures could teach him important lessons about care and patience. As they walked deeper into the forest, Neela pointed to a narrow stream. The water flowed quickly and some stones were slippery. Mark looked at her. She seemed to want him to cross carefully. He tested the stones, making sure they were stable, and then stepped across. Neela cheered softly, hopping to his shoulder once he reached the other side. Mark laughed. He had learned that even a simple stream could become a lesson in focus and trust. They continued exploring. Neela showed him tiny homes built from petals and leaves, some with small crystal windows. The homes were decorated with glowing moss and miniature furniture. Mark admired the tiny craftsmanship. He noticed how each home had a purpose, how every tiny alien contributed to the village, and how teamwork kept their world thriving. At midday, they stopped near a small clearing where a few tiny aliens were trying to lift a tiny cart filled with glowing crystals. Mark watched carefully. It was too heavy for them alone. He gently lifted the cart with his hands, moving it to the center of the clearing. The tiny aliens chirped happily, showing gratitude. Neela hopped on his hand and chirped in excitement. Mark realized that even his human strength could help the tiny aliens in ways he had never imagined. Neela then led Mark to a small hill where they could see the entire village. From this height, Mark noticed the careful layout of homes, bridges, gardens, and tiny paths. Everything seemed alive and vibrant. Neela pointed to different areas, chirping and moving excitedly. Mark felt proud to be part of this world, even in a small way. Later, Neela guided Mark to a small problem near the edge of the village. A tiny alien was stuck in a thick patch of vines. Mark carefully used a small stick to free the alien while Neela encouraged him. The tiny alien chirped happily and ran back to safety. Mark realized that even simple acts of help could build trust and friendship. Neela chirped softly, resting on his shoulder. He felt a warm sense of connection to her and the village. As the sun began to lower, Mark and Neela rested near a glowing pond. Tiny fish swam in the water, their bodies shimmering in the light. Neela pointed to the pond and showed him how the village used it for fresh water. Mark nodded, understanding that every resource, no matter how small, was important. He shared some ideas from Earth about storing water and keeping it clean. Neela chirped happily, hopping onto his hand in approval. By evening, Mark felt tired but happy. He had learned much about the tiny alien's world and shared a few lessons of his own. Neela chirped softly, resting on his shoulder. Mark realized how much he had grown. The tiny aliens had taught him patience, care, and teamwork. He had also learned that even small creatures could have great courage and intelligence. Mark looked around at the village. Tiny lights glowed from homes, bridges, and gardens, creating a magical view. He smiled at Neela. She chirped happily as if understanding his thoughts. Together they had learned, helped, and bonded. He realized that this partnership was more than guidance. It was friendship and trust. As night fell, Mark felt a sense of peace. The tiny village slept under the glowing stars, safe and secure. He held Neela carefully in his hand, thinking about the adventures ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and lessons. But for now, he was content. He had found a place where humans and tiny aliens could learn from each other, work together, and grow stronger as friends. Mark whispered softly to Neela, promising to protect and help their village whenever needed. Neela chirped happily in response. Mark smiled. Together they were ready to face anything, learning from each other and building a bond that would last far beyond this day. The morning on Leora began quietly, but Mark felt a change in the air. The wind blew stronger than usual and dark clouds formed above the treetops. Neela chirped nervously and pointed to the sky. Mark followed her gaze and saw the clouds moving fast, carrying a strange, heavy energy. Something was coming, and it could be dangerous for the tiny village. Mark and Neela ran through the village, warning the tiny aliens. The villagers looked up, chirping and moving quickly to prepare for the storm. Mark noticed that the small homes and bridges were fragile. If the storm hit hard, many could be damaged. Neela pointed to the homes, chirping urgently, showing him which areas needed the most attention. Mark thought quickly. He grabbed fallen leaves, twigs, and pieces of crystal that had fallen from the village homes. He began reinforcing the tiny bridges and securing the homes. Neela helped, carrying small leaves and chirping encouragement. The tiny aliens worked alongside them, following Mark's instructions and using their skills to strengthen their village. The wind grew stronger, making the trees sway. Rain began to fall in heavy drops. Mark held a large leaf over the tiniest aliens, shielding them from the water. Neela hopped onto his shoulder, chirping instructions. Together they moved quickly, guiding the villagers to safety. Mark felt a rush of responsibility, but he stayed calm. He had faced dangers before, but protecting an entire civilization of tiny beings was something new. Mark noticed a weak bridge connecting two homes. The bridge was small and the storm would likely break it. He ran carefully to the bridge and held it steady, while Neela and the tiny aliens reinforced it with twigs and vines. The wind threatened to push him, but he did not let go. Neela chirped softly, encouraging him. After several tense moments, the bridge was strong enough to hold. Mark stepped back, breathing hard but relieved. Next, Mark and Neela moved to the crystal storage area. Rainwater was starting to seep in, and the glowing crystals were at risk. Mark lifted the containers carefully, moving them to a safe spot under a thick leaf roof. Neela helped by carrying the smallest crystals and chirping happily whenever a task was completed. The tiny aliens followed, learning how to act quickly and protect their precious items. The storm hit harder, with strong gusts and heavy rain. Mark found a group of tiny aliens trapped near a narrow path. The wind threatened to push them off the trail. He held out his hands, letting them climb onto him one by one. Neela guided him, chirping directions and warning about loose branches. Mark felt a warm pride in his heart. He had saved them, just as they had trusted him before. As the storm continued, Mark saw that the village center was safe, but many of the smaller gardens and homes on the outskirts were at risk. He thought quickly, using fallen branches and vines to create barriers. Neela helped, carrying small leaves and chirping ideas. Together they worked through the rain, moving faster than the wind. Finally, the storm began to slow. The wind lessened and the rain turned to gentle drops. Mark and Neela looked around the village. The homes were wet, but the bridges were strong and the villagers were safe. Tiny aliens chirped happily, running to check their homes and gardens. Chief Pilo stepped forward, eyes shining with pride and gratitude. He chirped softly to Mark, pointing to Neela and then to him. Mark understood. The chief was praising their teamwork and courage. Mark smiled at Neela. She chirped happily, hopping onto his hand. Together they had faced a danger much bigger than themselves. Mark realized that the storm had tested more than the village. It had tested their partnership, trust, and problem-solving. The tiny aliens had learned that even though they were small, they could rely on friends from outside their world. By evening, the storm had passed completely. The sky was clear and the sunlight reflected on wet leaves and shining crystals. The village began to return to normal, and tiny aliens sang songs of gratitude. Mark felt proud. He had helped protect a civilization much smaller than himself, but their courage and teamwork had made the difference. As Mark and Neela rested near the village center, the chief came forward again. He held a small glowing crystal and gestured to Mark. Mark understood that this was a special gift, a symbol of respect and thanks. He accepted it carefully, feeling the warmth of trust and friendship. Neela chirped happily, resting on his hand. Mark looked around at the tiny village. The storm had shown him that courage, intelligence, and teamwork could overcome any challenge. Even small beings working together with humans could protect their home. Mark smiled at Neela. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, and he felt ready. Together, they would face whatever challenges came next. The morning sun rose over Leora, spreading golden light through the trees. Mark woke to the sound of tiny voices singing and chirping happily. Yesterday's storm had tested the village, but now everything seemed calm and peaceful again. He stretched and looked at Neela. She chirped excitedly, hopping on his shoulder. Today felt special. Chief Pilo had called another meeting in the village center. Mark followed Neela through the bridges and paths, careful with each step. Tiny aliens were gathering, their eyes shining with respect and curiosity. Mark noticed their faces filled with admiration. He felt a warm pride in his chest. The villagers were not only grateful, they respected him. Chief Pilo stood in the center, holding a small glowing crystal in his tiny hands. He raised it high and the entire village became silent. Mark watched closely. The chief's eyes were kind but serious. He gestured toward Mark and made soft musical sounds. Then he pointed to Neela and back to Mark. Mark realized the chief was praising the bond he had formed with Neela. and the courage he had shown during the storm. He felt honored. Even though he had only acted to help, the tiny aliens were recognizing his intelligence, bravery, and kindness. Neela chirped happily, hopping onto his hand as if sharing the chief's praise. Then Chief Pilo gestured to the villagers. Each tiny alien came forward offering small gifts. Some brought petals, others small crystals, and a few carried tiny fruits. Mark accepted each gift carefully. He understood that this was their way of saying thank you and showing respect. Every gift carried meaning, and he felt the weight of their gratitude. After the gifts, Chief Pilo made more gestures. Mark watched and realized the chief was explaining something important. The mini-companion Neela was not just a helper. She symbolized trust, friendship, and the bond between humans and the tiny aliens. Mark smiled. What had seemed strange at first now made sense. It was not about control or obligation, it was about respect, learning, and connection. Mark looked at Neela. She chirped happily, her tiny eyes sparkling. She had guided him, helped him, and taught him much about their world. He realized that she was more than a guide. She was a friend and a partner in protecting the village. Together they had faced the storm and learned from each other. The chief motioned again and pointed to the village. Mark understood. He had shown courage, intelligence, and care, and the village now fully trusted him. The tiny aliens chirped in celebration, moving joyfully around their homes and bridges. Mark felt a deep sense of belonging. He had entered their world as a stranger, but was now part of it in a meaningful way. Mark spent the rest of the morning walking through the village with Neela. The tiny aliens greeted him warmly, chirping and pointing to things he had helped protect. Bridges he had strengthened, homes he had secured, and gardens he had shielded from the storm were now safe. He felt proud of his work. The village was not just surviving, it was thriving. He noticed that the tiny aliens were watching his every move with admiration and curiosity. They seemed to study how he thought and acted. Mark realized that humans and tiny aliens could learn from each other. His knowledge could help them, and their clever ideas could teach him new ways of thinking. By midday, Mark and Neela returned to the village center. Chief Pilo raised his tiny arms and made one last gesture. Mark understood it as a final blessing of respect. The chief gave Mark a larger glowing crystal. Its light was warm and steady. Mark held it carefully, feeling the trust and friendship it represented. Neela chirped and hopped onto Mark's shoulder. Together they watched the tiny aliens continue their work. Some were rebuilding homes, others were collecting fruits, and a few were polishing crystals. Mark smiled. The village had recovered quickly, and he knew that the tiny aliens had grown stronger because of the challenges they had faced together. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Mark sat quietly near a glowing pond. Neela rested on his hand. The village glowed softly in the evening light, peaceful and safe. Mark felt proud but also humbled. The tiny aliens had given him respect and trust, but he knew that he had also learned from them. Their courage, intelligence, and care for one another had inspired him. Mark whispered softly to Neela, promising to protect their village whenever they needed him. She chirped happily as if understanding his words. Mark smiled, feeling the deep bond he had formed. Chief Pilo in the village had given him respect, but in return he had gained friendship, purpose, and a sense of connection he had never felt before. The day ended with the village calm and glowing. Mark held Neela gently in his hand, thinking about the adventures that had brought them together. He realized that respect was not just about words or gifts, it was about actions, courage, and trust. Mark felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together with Neela, he could face anything. The morning sun spread soft light across the tiny village of Leora. Mark packed his small supplies, ready to continue his journey across the stars. Neela chirped softly and hopped onto his shoulder, her eyes filled with curiosity and a little sadness. Today was different. He would be leaving the village he had grown to love. Chief Pilo and the villagers had gathered in the center to say goodbye. Tiny aliens filled the bridges and treetops, their eyes shining with respect and affection. Mark felt a warm weight in his chest. He had come as a stranger, but now he was leaving as a trusted friend and protector. Chief Pilo stepped forward, holding a glowing crystal in his tiny hands. He raised it high and the village became silent. Mark understood the meaning. The crystal was a symbol of friendship, trust, and the bond they had formed. He accepted it carefully, feeling the warmth of the gesture. Neela chirped happily, hopping onto his hand as if sharing in the honor. One by one, tiny aliens approached Mark to offer small gifts. Some brought petals from glowing flowers, others gave tiny crystals, and a few presented small fruits. Mark accepted each gift with care, understanding that every offering carried deep meaning. It was their way of saying thank you and showing how much they valued him. Nyla chirped and nudged Mark gently. She wanted to show him a hidden path in the village. They walked together, visiting places he had helped protect, bridges he had reinforced, and gardens he had safeguarded. The tiny aliens watched them, chirping joyfully as if celebrating the bond between humans and their friends from another world. Mark looked around at the village. Every home, every bridge, and every garden glowed softly in the morning light. He felt proud and grateful. The tiny aliens had taught him lessons about courage, patience, and teamwork. In return, he had helped them face dangers and protect their home. Together, they had built something stronger than simple friendship. They had built trust and understanding. Chief Pilo approached again. He chirped softly and pointed to Neela, then to Mark, and finally to the sky. Mark realized the chief was giving a blessing for his journey. He nodded, understanding the deep respect behind the gesture. Neela chirped happily, hopping onto his shoulder. She seemed ready to see him go, but also happy that he would carry their friendship across the stars. Mark knelt down carefully to speak to Neela. He whispered softly that he would never forget her or the village. Neela chirped and touched his hand gently with her tiny paw. It was a silent promise that they would always be connected, no matter the distance. Mark smiled, feeling the strength of their bond. As Mark prepared to leave, the villagers gathered closer. Chief Pilo raised his arms, and the entire village joined in a soft, harmonious chirping. The sound was filled with warmth, gratitude, and hope. Mark felt his heart swell. He realized that the smallest beings could have the greatest courage and the deepest hearts. Neela chirped once more and hopped onto his hand. Mark lifted her gently to his shoulder, feeling her tiny warmth. Together, they walked to the edge of the village where his spaceship waited. The tiny aliens watched silently, their eyes shining with admiration and respect. Mark waved, and they chirped back in harmony. Before stepping into his ship, Mark turned to Chief Pilo. He held out his hand in friendship. The chief placed a tiny glowing crystal in his palm, a final gift to carry their bond with him. Mark smiled and nodded, understanding the importance of this gesture. It was more than a gift. It was a promise of continued friendship and trust across worlds. Mark stepped into his spaceship, Neela perched safely on his shoulder. The engines hummed and the ship began to lift. He looked down at the village, feeling a deep connection to every tiny home and every glowing garden. He knew that he had made a real difference, and that his time with the tiny aliens had changed him. As the spaceship rose into the sky, Mark whispered to Neela that he would return if they ever needed help. Neela chirped in response, touching his hand with her tiny paw. It was a silent promise shared between them. Mark smiled, feeling the warmth of friendship and trust fill his heart. The village of Leora grew smaller beneath him, but its glow remained in his mind. Mark realized that even the smallest beings could inspire courage, creativity, and hope. He had protected them, learned from them, and formed bonds that would last far beyond this adventure. As the stars appeared in the sky above, Mark set his course for new worlds, carrying the glowing crystal and the lessons of the tiny village. Neela chirped softly, and Mark laughed quietly. Together they had proven that friendship, courage, and respect could bridge any distance, no matter how small or how vast. Mark looked ahead, ready for new adventures. The memory of Leora and the tiny aliens filled him with hope and determination. He knew that wherever he traveled, the bond he had formed with Neela and the village would guide him. Their trust and friendship would remain with him forever.